The first tremor of their impending stupidity arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a mauve envelope that clashed violently with the weathered oak of my mailbox. Mauve, the color of a dying bruise, or perhaps a particularly self-important brand of fungal infection. It was from the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association, a name so ludicrously misapplied it bordered on performance art. There was no harmony in Harmony Creek, not since Brenda Krause, a woman whose primary source of joy appeared to be the meticulous regulation of other people's lives, had seized control of the HOA presidency like a miniature, peroxide blonde Napoleon annexing a particularly dull suburb. The letter, penned in a font that screamed passive aggression, informed me in no uncertain terms that the unapproved and potentially hazardous earthen structure on the northern edge of my property required immediate assessment and, most likely, removal. My dam. My grandfather's dam, built with his own calloused hands and a stubborn Swede's understanding of how water, earth, and gravity like to dance. It had stood for 70 years, a silent guardian protecting our 10 acres from the seasonal tantrums of Miller's Creek, the very creek that Harmony Creek, the subdivision, had carelessly encroached upon decades after my family had settled here. This land, this water, it was in my blood, a legacy of sweat and foresight. I'd spent my early career as a hydrological engineer, consulting on projects from the Mekong Delta to the unpredictable glacial melts in Patagonia. I knew water. I knew its power, its treachery, its immutable logic. Brenda Krause, I suspected, knew only the thrill of wielding her little plastic gavel. The initial complaints had been laughably petty. My grass, apparently, possessed a rebellious streak, daring to grow a quarter inch beyond the mandated 2.5 inches. My recycling bin, one memorable week, had been positioned with its handle facing south-southwest instead of the HOA-approved due south. These were the skirmishes, the border provocations. The dam, however, was a declaration of war. I responded to the mauve missive with a calm 2-page letter, complete with notarized copies of the original county permits for the dam's construction from 1953. A structural integrity report I'd commissioned myself 5 years prior, which confirmed it was as solid as my grandfather's stubbornness, and a polite refusal to consider its removal. I pointed out, with what I hoped was an air of patient expertise, that the dam actually mitigated minor downstream flooding for the newer developments, including several properties within Harmony Creek itself, by controlling surge flow from the upper watershed. This, I thought, was logic. This was fact. I had yet to learn that in Brenda's world, facts were inconvenient flies to be swatted away with the rolled-up newspaper of her authority. Brenda, predictably, escalated. At the next HOA meeting, a bi-monthly torture session I usually avoided, like a flesh-eating bacteria, she presented the dam as an imminent threat, a ticking time bomb of mud and hubris. She painted me as an isolationist, a rogue element defying the collective good. This structure, she'd hissed, her voice quivering with manufactured outrage, is an eyesore, a blight on our community's aesthetic, and, more importantly, a potential danger of catastrophic proportions. She produced no evidence, no expert testimony, only her own incandescent certainty. A few of the newer residents, fresh-faced and eager to assimilate into the beige tyranny of Harmony Creek, nodded along, their expressions a mixture of fear and civic responsibility. The older ones, those who remembered when Miller's Creek was more than just a decorative hazard on the 7th hole of the golf course, remained silent, their eyes downcast. They knew. But knowing and speaking were two different territories in Brenda's kingdom. My inner monologue at the time was a cocktail of weary annoyance and a dangerous underestimation of her venom. She was a gnat, buzzing at the periphery. I had work to do, a family to care for, my wife, Sarah, and our 2 children, Emily and Tom, who loved that dam, that creek, that small wilderness at the edge of our curated lives. Little did Brenda Krause know, I'd once diverted a flash flood in the Andes with nothing more than 3 sandbags, a broken shovel, and a well-argued prayer to whatever local deity oversaw hydrological chaos. She was about to learn, in the most literal sense, that you don't poke a man who understands the terrible, beautiful mathematics of moving water. The battle lines were drawn, not in ink on some HOA bylaw, but in the very soil my grandfather had shaped, in the patient flow of the creek he had learned to respect. And Brenda, in her mauve-tinted arrogance, was already marching blindly towards the abyss. The second mauve envelope felt heavier, denser, not just with paper, but with the sheer, unadulterated audacity of its contents. Brenda wasn't just doubling down. She was attempting to rewrite the laws of physics and common sense through sheer willpower and the HOA's letterhead. I, in turn, began my own meticulous siege. I delved into the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CCRs, a document so convoluted and self-contradictory, it could have been drafted by a committee of drunken lawyers with a vendetta against clarity. As I suspected, the clauses regarding earthen structures were laughably vague, clearly intended for garden berms or decorative retaining walls, not a 70-year-old, county-approved dam, with a documented history of flood mitigation. My grandfather, bless his pragmatic soul, had ensured every I was dotted and to crossed with the county planners of his day. The dam wasn't just on my land. It was practically grandfathered into the geological record. I prepared a new dossier, thicker this time. It included enlarged copies of the relevant CC, R sections with my annotations, a detailed history of the dam's construction and its demonstrable benefits, and sworn affidavits from 2 independent civil engineers, one of whom, a crusty old fellow named Alistair Finch, had practically written the book on small dam safety in the state, attesting to its structural soundness and positive hydrological impact. I presented this at a specially convened HOA fact-finding meeting, a tribunal masquerading as a discussion. Brenda presided, her face a mask of strained impartiality that fooled no one. My presentation was calm, factual, a lecture more than a defense. I laid out the engineering principles, the flow dynamics, the sheer irrefutable logic of the dam's existence. I might as well have been explaining quantum mechanics to a particularly stubborn houseplant. Then came the warnings. The long-range forecasts were unequivocal. We were heading into a La Niña cycle, one predicted to be the wettest in a generation. Local meteorologists, my old contacts at the National Weather Service, even the Farmer's Almanac, were all singing the same dire chorus of torrential rain. I compiled these forecasts, along with hydrological models I ran myself, projecting the potential inundation levels for Harmony Creek without my dam acting as a crucial buffer. The models were chilling. Several cul-de-sacs, including the one Brenda Krause herself resided on, would become, for all intents and purposes, extensions of Miller's Creek. I presented this data, not as a threat, but as a solemn, documented warning. I sent registered letters to every member of the HOA board, outlining the specific risks, the predicted timelines, the potential consequences of removing the dam, especially before the anticipated rainy season. The dam, I wrote, currently protects not only my property but also significant portions of Harmony Creek from precisely the kind of inundation your own development's inadequate storm drainage systems are incapable of handling. Removing it, particularly now, would be an act of profound irresponsibility. Brenda's response was pure, weaponized denial. She stood before the next HOA gathering, my printed warnings clutched in her hand like a shield against reason, and declared my predictions to be scaremongering, a desperate tactic to preserve an illegal and unsightly structure. She accused me of trying to hold the community hostage with my so-called expertise. This was the moral violation, the point where her petty tyranny curdled into something darker, something genuinely dangerous. She wasn't just ignoring facts, she was actively suppressing them, painting the person delivering the warning as the enemy. She twisted my concern for their safety into an act of aggression. Several residents, those whose homes were situated on slightly higher ground, or who simply couldn't fathom the scale of the predicted rains, nodded along, their faces reflecting Brenda's smug disdain. My family felt the pressure. Sarah's usually steady composure began to fray. Emily, my bright, perceptive daughter, asked me why Mrs. Krause hated our dam so much. Some people, honey, I'd told her, my voice carefully neutral, are more comfortable with rules they make up than with realities they can't control. My inner monologue, however, was far from neutral. A cold, precise anger was beginning to crystallize. They weren't just stupid. They were willfully, dangerously ignorant. They were so cocooned in their HOA-mandated conformity that they couldn't see the raw, elemental power of the natural world they had so blithely built upon. They mistook my patience for weakness, my expertise for arrogance. The warnings were logged, dated, and filed. Every email, every registered letter, every dismissive quote from Brenda at an HOA meeting meticulously archived. If they were determined to sail into the storm with no rudder and a hole in the hull, I would ensure the lighthouse keeper's log was impeccably detailed. The water was rising, metaphorically for now, but the real deluge was on its way, and they were gleefully dismantling the only umbrella in sight. The ultimatum arrived not in mauve, but in a stark, white, brutally official envelope from the HOA's newly retained legal counsel, a firm named Pike, Snodgrass, Grew, a name that sounded less like a law firm and more like a list of things you'd find festering under a rotten log. The letter was a masterpiece of legalese, a thicket of whereas, as, and therefore be it resolved, s, all culminating in a single blood-chilling demand. Demolish the dam within 30 days, or face a fine of $500,000. $500,000. The sum was so outrageously disproportionate to the alleged offense, the continued existence of a perfectly safe, historically permitted, and demonstrably beneficial structure, that it transcended mere bullying and entered the realm of extortion. This wasn't about a dam anymore. This was about power, about Brenda Krause's insatiable need to crush any opposition, to make an example of me. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter spread out before me, the ink seeming to radiate a cold, malevolent energy. Sarah read it over my shoulder, her breath catching in her throat. The color drained from her face. "They can't be serious," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but they were. The letter cited obscure clauses, twisted interpretations of county ordinances, which I knew were being misrepresented, and the supposed will of the community, as if Brenda's personal vendetta was now a sacred mandate. My own lawyer, a cautious, by-the-book man named Arthur Jenkins, blanched when I showed him the letter. "This is aggressive," he'd understated, adjusting his spectacles. "We can fight it, of course. File an injunction. Challenge the HOA's authority on this scale. But it will be costly, protracted, and the outcome uncertain. HOAs wield a surprising amount of power in this state." He spoke of depositions, court fees, expert witness retainers. He painted a picture of a long, draining war of attrition, a financial black hole that could swallow our savings, our peace of mind. The stress on my family was becoming palpable. Emily was having trouble sleeping. Tom, usually boisterous, grew quiet and withdrawn. My wife looked at me with a mixture of fear and a desperate hope that I could somehow make this all go away. Her tears, shed late one night, when she thought I was asleep, were the final straw. They were a corrosive acid on my carefully constructed composure, dissolving the last vestiges of my willingness to engage these people on a rational level. Reason had failed. Logic had been dismissed. Warnings had been mocked. Now, they had come for my family's security, threatening us with financial ruin. This was the line. They had crossed it with jackboots and a brass band. Brenda, I heard, was preening. She'd apparently announced the fine at a hastily called emergency OA coffee clatch, her voice triumphant, her posture radiating the smug satisfaction of a predator that has finally cornered its prey. She was, by all accounts, basking in the glow of her perceived victory. The looks from some neighbors became a mixture of pity and a certain morbid curiosity. What would he do? How could he possibly fight this? My inner world, however, had undergone a seismic shift. The initial shock, the anger, the frustration, these emotions hadn't vanished, but they had coalesced, compressed into a diamond-hard core of cold, calculating resolve. The 500 fine wasn't a penalty. It was a catalyst. It was the precise amount of pressure needed to transform a reluctant warrior into an instrument of focused, tactical retribution. They had mistaken my patience for passivity, my attempts at dialogue for weakness. They had no earthly idea of the storm they had just unleashed. The fine was their declaration of war. And I, in the quiet solitude of my study, surrounded by hydrological charts, topographical maps, and the silent 70-year-old wisdom of my grandfather's legacy, began to plan my campaign. A campaign they would never see coming, waged not in courtrooms or HOA meetings, but with the very earth and water they so profoundly misunderstood. The legal document in my hand wasn't just a demand. It was their beautifully penned, legally binding death warrant. Metaphorically speaking, of course. The irony was almost too delicious. They thought they were cornering me. In reality, they were handing me the keys to their own destruction. The snap, when it came, wasn't a sound heard by anyone but me. It wasn't the crack of a man breaking under pressure, but the precise, satisfying click of a complex mechanism locking into place. A switch flipped in my mind, a cold, clear circuit engaging. Outwardly, I projected defeat. I let it be known, through carefully chosen, hesitant words to a few sympathetic neighbors, who I knew would act as unintentional conduits to Brenda's intelligence network, that I was exploring my options, that the fine was devastating, that I was unsure how to proceed. I allowed Sarah to voice her anxieties openly, her genuine distress serving as perfect camouflage for the chillingly calm resolve solidifying within me. Brenda, predictably, lapped it up. Reports trickled back of her smug pronouncements, her assertions that I was finally seeing reason, that resistance was futile. She was, in her own delusional narrative, the conquering hero, the vanquisher of rogue dams and defiant homeowners. My decision was made, not in a fit of pique, but with the methodical detachment of a surgeon planning a complex, unavoidable operation. I would demolish the dam. I would comply with their demand, to the letter, and in doing so, I would give them exactly what they deserved. The snap was the realization that I didn't need to fight them on their terms anymore. They had handed me a weapon, gift-wrapped in legalese, and aimed it squarely at their own feet. My old friend, Dave Hagland, a retired Army Corps of Engineers colonel who lived 2 streets over, outside the HOA's stifling jurisdiction, was the only one who saw through the charade. Dave had a mind like a steel trap and an uncanny ability to read the subtle tells of human behavior, a skill honed by decades of dealing with contractors, bureaucrats, and the occasional hostile foreign government. He'd found me one afternoon staring at the dam, not with sadness, but with an intensity that he later described as alarmingly serene. He didn't offer platitudes or sympathy. He just handed me a thermos of coffee, black and strong, the way we both liked it. We stood in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds, the gentle murmur of the creek and the distant hum of suburban life. "So," Dave finally said, his voice a low rumble, "they actually put that absurd number in writing, did they?" I nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. $500,000. Non-negotiable, apparently. Dave let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. "Those imbeciles. They wouldn't know a load-bearing wall from a load of bull. You thinking of fighting it?" I met his gaze. His eyes, sharp and knowing, held no judgment, only a keen, analytical curiosity. "I'm thinking of complying, Dave," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. Dave raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Complying? You? The man who argued with a 3-star general over spillway gradients in a monsoon and won?" "Sometimes, Colonel," I replied, a ghost of a smile playing on my lips. "The most effective maneuver is to give the enemy exactly what they think they want." A slow grin spread across Dave's weathered face. He took a long swig of coffee, his eyes twinkling with a sudden, almost feral amusement. "Planning something biblical, are we, Peterson?" he chuckled. "Something involving a great deal of accurately predicted precipitation?" I didn't answer directly. I just looked out at the dam, my grandfather's legacy, the silent guardian. And then I looked towards Harmony Creek, towards the neat rows of houses, the manicured lawns, the blind, blissful ignorance. "They've demanded the removal of a critical piece of flood control infrastructure, Dave, on the eve of what every expert predicts will be a historically wet season. They've put that demand in writing, backed by a punitive, legally actionable fine. I'm simply going to honor their request." My planning phase began that evening. It was meticulous, obsessive. I wasn't just going to demolish a dam. I was going to deconstruct it with the precision of a watchmaker, timing each phase to coincide with the increasingly dire meteorological forecasts. I pulled out my original blueprints of the dam, the ones my grandfather had sketched on linen paper, updated with my own annotations from repairs and reinforcements I'd made over the years. I cross-referenced them with county topographical surveys, LiDAR data I accessed through a university contact, and advanced hydrological flow models I ran on my own high-powered workstation. The goal wasn't just removal. It was channeled removal. A strategic retreat of earth and stone that would, in its absence, direct the inevitable deluge with pinpoint accuracy. Brenda Krause thought she was dictating terms. She had no idea she was merely a pawn in a much larger, much wetter game, a game orchestrated by the laws of nature and a man she had fatally underestimated. The snap wasn't me breaking, it was me becoming unbreakable, a conduit for a justice as cold and relentless as the coming floodwaters. The preparation phase was an exercise in cold, calculated orchestration, a symphony of impending consequence, where I was both composer and conductor. The tactical ops metaphor wasn't just a turn of phrase in my mind, it was the literal framework for every decision. My home office transformed into a command center. Topographical maps overlaid with projected floodplains covered one wall, dotted with pins marking critical elevations and drainage pathways, particularly those leading directly into the lowest-lying sections of Harmony Creek, where Brenda Krause and her most ardent supporters resided. Another wall was dedicated to meteorological charts, updated hourly, tracking the relentless westward march of the storm systems the National Weather Service had begun to name with increasing gravity. I cross-referenced barometric pressures, wind shear data, and satellite imagery of moisture plumes that stretched across the Pacific like malevolent gray fingers. The massive rain season wasn't just coming. It was practically knocking at the door. I contacted 3 demolition companies, not the cheapest, nor the most advertised, but ones known for precision and adherence to complex instructions. I interviewed the foremen, gauging not just their competence with heavy machinery, but their willingness to follow a highly specific, phased demolition plan without asking too many questions. The one I chose, a stoic outfit run by a man named Kowalski, whose vocabulary seemed to consist primarily of grunts and nods, understood the language of engineering. I provided him with a detailed schematic, not of the dam's construction, but of its deconstruction. Phase 1, I explained, pointing to a section of the eastern spillway, is the removal of these riprap reinforcements and the widening of the existing overflow channel by precisely 3 meters. This needs to be completed by Tuesday, end of day. Phase 2, my finger moved to a specific point on the dam's central crest, is a controlled breach here at grid reference Alpha 7. Not a catastrophic failure, mind you, but a progressive excavation, timed to coincide with specific, let's call them environmental factors. No deviation from the timeline or the sequence. Understood, Kowalski grunted, a sound I interpreted as crystal clear. I secured the necessary demolition permits from the county, a process made surprisingly smooth by the HOA's own prior complaints about the unpermitted structure. The irony was thick enough to spread on toast. My permit application included a copy of the HOA's demand letter and the $500 fine notice as justification for the urgency. The county clerk, a weary woman named Agnes who had seen her share of suburban squabbles, merely stamped it with a sigh that seemed to encompass the entirety of human folly. Meanwhile, I played the part of the beleaguered homeowner. I made a show of consulting with Arthur Jenkins, my lawyer, discussing imaginary legal strategies in hushed, anxious tones whenever I suspected Brenda's spies were within earshot. I even allowed a rumor to circulate that I was considering taking out a second mortgage to pay the fine, a fiction that no doubt filled Brenda with a perverse sense of triumph. My sidekick in this quiet war, Dave Hagland, proved invaluable. His network of contacts from his Army Corps days was a goldmine. He procured detailed, ground-penetrating radar scans of the area between my property and Harmony Creek, revealing old, forgotten drainage culverts and subtle shifts in the water table that the original Harmony Creek developers had conveniently overlooked or deliberately ignored. They built half these houses on what amounts to a sponge, Peterson, Dave had remarked, poring over the scans. A stiff rain would have given them wet basements. What you're planning, well, let's just say they're going to need snorkels for their prize-winning petunias. I also began documenting Brenda's increasingly smug pronouncements. She was holding court at the community pool, at neighborhood barbecues, even in the aisles of the local supermarket, recounting her victory over the recalcitrant Mr. Peterson. Transcripts of her gloating, relayed by sympathetic, or simply gossipy neighbors, were meticulously entered into my digital log, time-stamped and cross-referenced with the latest weather alerts flashing across my screens. Zoom-ins on documents. The demolition permit, stark and official. Blueprints, crisscrossed with new red lines indicating flow paths. Maps, highlighted with the projected inundation zones. Drone surveillance, not literal, but in my mind's eye, I flew over Harmony Creek, watching the invisible pathways the water would soon take. Thermal camera overlays. Again, metaphorical, imagining the cold dread that would soon replace their smug warmth. My inner monologue was a constant stream of tactical assessments, risk calculations, and a grim, almost detached satisfaction. Every cubic yard of earth removed, I thought, watching the satellite loop of the approaching storm, is a step closer to equilibrium. They sowed the wind with their arrogance. They will reap the whirlwind, channeled with surgical precision. There was a cold beauty to it, a terrible symmetry. They wanted the dam gone. They would get their wish. And with it, a lesson in humility delivered by the ton, courtesy of Mother Nature, with a little help from a very motivated hydrological engineer. The porch light of their ignorance was about to be extinguished by a flood of reality. The day of demolition dawned gray and oppressive, the air thick with unspoken anticipation, at least on my part. For Brenda Krause and her coterie, it was a day of triumph, the culmination of their righteous crusade. They actually gathered, a small knot of them, on the edge of my property line, a safe, HOA-approved distance, of course, to witness the demise of their nemesis, the earthen heart of my grandfather's legacy. Brenda wore a lurid pink pantsuit, a beacon of smugness in the muted landscape. Her smile was a predatory slash. Kowalski's crew arrived precisely at 800 hours. Their heavy machinery, an excavator, a bulldozer, 2 dump trucks, rumbling onto my land like instruments of a very specific, very loud orchestra. I met Kowalski, handed him a final, updated timeline that factored in the latest, most dire NWS storm surge predictions. He grunted his understanding, his eyes briefly flicking towards the cluster of HOA voyeurs, then back to me, a flicker of something that might have been grim amusement in their depths. Phase 1 commenced, the meticulous deconstruction of the eastern spillway's reinforcements. The excavator's bucket, guided with surprising delicacy, began to pull away the heavy riprap stones, then systematically widened the channel. It wasn't a chaotic smashing. It was a careful, almost surgical alteration of the land's contours. Brenda and her companions watched, their chatter occasionally drifting over, snippets of self-congratulation, patronizing remarks about my finally seeing sense. I ignored them, my focus entirely on the work, on the sky, on the almost imperceptible shift in the wind that heralded the approaching front. Around noon, as Kowalski's men were finishing the spillway modifications, the first fat raindrops began to fall. Sporadic at first, then with increasing insistence. A nervous ripple went through Brenda's little gallery. One of them, a woman named Doris, whose prize-winning roses were legendary, produced a flimsy umbrella. Brenda herself merely pursed her lips, as if the weather itself was a minor inconvenience she would deal with later, via a sharply worded letter. I checked my watch. 13:45. The NWS update at 13:30 had upgraded the storm to a severe weather event, predicting localized rainfall rates of up to 3 inches per hour. Right on schedule. Kowalski, I said, my voice calm. Phase 2. Commence controlled breach at Alpha 7. Slow and steady. He nodded, relayed the order. The bulldozer, a massive yellow beast, began to lumber towards the designated point on the dam's crest. This was it, the point of no return. Brenda, perhaps sensing the shift in tempo, the almost ceremonial gravity of the moment, called out, her voice sharp with triumph. Finally getting rid of that monstrosity, Mr. Peterson! About time you listened to the community. I turned slowly, met her gaze across the muddying ground. The rain was plastering my hair to my forehead, but I felt an almost preternatural calm. The community, Brenda, I said, my voice carrying easily over the rumble of the bulldozer, is about to experience a significant hydrological event, one that some of us tried to warn you about. Her smile faltered, just for a second, replaced by a flicker of something. Annoyance, confusion, not fear, not yet. That would come later. Don't be dramatic, she sniffed, recovering her composure. It's just a bit of rain. We have excellent drainage in Harmony Creek. I almost smiled. Excellent drainage has its limits, Brenda, as you're about to discover. The bulldozer began its work, its massive blade biting into the compacted earth of the dam's crest. Not a violent assault, but a steady, methodical removal. Earth that had held back Miller's Creek for 70 years began to yield. A trickle of water, then a stream, then a surge, began to pour through the engineered gap. It wasn't the catastrophic wall of water Brenda had so often invoked in her fear-mongering speeches. It was a measured release, the creek reasserting its ancient claim, guided by the channels I had, through Kowalski, so carefully prepared. The rain intensified, no longer fat drops but a driving sheet, visibility dropping. Brenda's pink pantsuit was rapidly turning a miserable shade of puce. Her companions were huddling together, their festive mood thoroughly dampened. The symbolic blood, the moral cost of this action, weighed on me, but it was a necessary burden. This wasn't vengeance for its own sake. It was the inevitable outcome of their arrogance, a consequence I was merely facilitating. My grandfather built this dam to protect, to nurture. Its removal, ironically, would serve a similar, if harsher, purpose, to teach a lesson in respect for forces larger than any HOA bylaw. The water flowing through the breach was the sound of a debt being called in, a debt incurred by ignorance and paid in full by the impending deluge. The lock on the gate of their complacency was being systematically dismantled. The heavens didn't just open, they ruptured. The rain transformed from a mere downpour into a vertical ocean, a furious, relentless assault that blurred the world into shades of gray and swirling water. It was biblical, cinematic, precisely the kind of meteorological apocalypse the models had predicted and Brenda Krause had scornfully dismissed. And it arrived, as if on cue, mere hours after the final, carefully engineered breach in my grandfather's dam. Or perhaps, I mused, watching the torrent from the dry vantage of my covered porch, it arrived on my cue. My property, situated on a slight rise, and now with unimpeded drainage directly away from my home thanks to the pre-demolition contouring, shed the water like a duck's back. The strategic removal of the dam, specifically the engineered breach at Alpha 7 and the widened eastern spillway, was performing exactly as designed. Miller's Creek, swollen to a raging chocolate-brown serpent, was no longer buffered. Its full, unrestrained fury, augmented by the relentless downpour, was now channeled away from my land. Channeled with brutal hydrological precision towards the lower-lying, inadequately drained properties of Harmony Creek, particularly towards the cul-de-sacs where Brenda Krause, Doris of the prize-winning Roses, and several other of the HOA's most vocal dam removal advocates resided. The visual metaphors I'd entertained during planning were now stark reality. The fence of their denial was being washed away. The porch light of their smug security was sputtering, soon to be drowned. The news, when it started to filter through via frantic social media posts and the distant wail of sirens, was grimly satisfying. Harmony Creek is flooding. Water rising fast on Primrose Lane. Cars underwater on Lilac Circle. These were not minor puddles. These were homes, prized lawns, meticulously landscaped gardens, the very symbols of their suburban idyll, succumbing to the relentless brown tide. First, the roads became rivers. Then the rivers became lakes, creeping up driveways, swallowing mailboxes, licking at front doors. I imagined Brenda's pink pantsuit, now thoroughly ruined, as she waded through her rapidly submerging living room, her shrill commands utterly useless against the indifferent onslaught of 1,000 tons of water. There was a certain cold, poetic justice to it. They had demanded the removal of a structure that had, for decades, quietly protected them. They had dismissed expertise, mocked warnings, and prioritized aesthetic fantasy over physical reality. Now, reality was delivering its rebuttal, a liquid lecture in humility. The silent majority of neighbors, those who had watched the unfolding drama with a mixture of apprehension and resignation, were a mixed bag. Some, on higher ground, were spared the worst. Others, caught in the indiscriminate path of the floodwaters, were undoubtedly suffering. I felt a pang of regret for them, the collateral damage in Brenda's war. But my primary focus, my grim satisfaction, was reserved for those who had actively, maliciously engineered this outcome. My inner monologue was a quiet counterpoint to the storm's roar. They called my dam an unapproved structure. Now they face an unapproved floodplain. They worried about aesthetic blight. Now they have genuine, waterlogged devastation. They demanded I manage my water. And so I have. It is now managed directly to their doorsteps. The family was safe, dry, and watching the news reports with wide eyes. Sarah looked at me, a complex emotion in her gaze, relief, a touch of fear, and a dawning understanding of the lengths I would go to protect what was ours and to see justice done. "You knew," she whispered, not an accusation, but a statement of fact. "You knew this would happen." I nodded. "Water follows the path of least resistance, Sarah. I just helped remove the obstructions they insisted upon. The dam, even in its absence, was still dictating the flow. Its ghost, a far more vengeful entity than its earthen form had ever been. The locked gate wasn't just psychological closure. It was the sluice gate I had been forced to open, unleashing a torrent they had arrogantly believed they could control or ignore. The blood, the moral cost, was the chilling knowledge that I had orchestrated this, albeit with their full, documented, legally binding complicity. They had pulled the trigger. I had simply aimed the barrel. The immediate aftermath was a symphony of chaos, a cacophony of sirens, flashing lights, and the shrill, panicked cries of the newly dispossessed. Harmony Creek, or at least its lower-lying, more arrogant sectors, resembled a disaster zone. Mud-caked cars sat askew in driveways that were now shallow ponds. Furniture, garden gnomes, and an astonishing number of pink plastic flamingos bobbed mournfully in the receding, but still substantial floodwaters. News crews, smelling a story juicier than the usual lost cat or pothole complaint, descended like vultures, their cameras panning across the devastation, their microphones eagerly seeking out tales of woe and outrage. And outrage there was, primarily emanating from one Brenda Krause. She was a magnificent spectacle of sodden fury. Her peroxide hair hung in lank, muddy clumps. Her once pristine, and presumably expensive tracksuit was stained and clinging. She stood, ankle-deep in what used to be her award-winning zoysia grass, pointing a trembling, accusing finger towards my property, which sat serenely dry on its gentle rise. "He did this!" she shrieked at a beleaguered-looking police chief, a man named Henderson whom I knew to be generally reasonable. "This is Peterson's fault. He deliberately flooded us. Arrest him!" Chief Henderson, to his credit, looked thoroughly unimpressed by Brenda's histrionics. He had a clipboard in his hand, and his expression was one of weary resignation. I had already called him, early that morning, as the waters began to truly surge, not to confess, but to report compliance with the HOA's demand and to express my deep concern for the unfolding situation. I had also emailed him and the County Emergency Management Office copies of my entire file, the HOA's letters, the 500 fine notice, my demolition permit, my prior documented warnings about the flood risk, complete with meteorological data and hydrological projections. When Henderson finally made his way to my driveway, sidestepping a dislodged rosebush of Doris's that had made an impressive voyage downstream, I met him with a thermos of coffee and a manila envelope containing hard copies of everything. "Chief," I said, my voice calm, measured. "As you know, I complied with the Harmony Creek HOA's legally binding demand to demolish my dam, a demand made under duress of a $500,000 fine. The timing, unfortunately, coincided with the severe weather event that I, and numerous meteorological services, had repeatedly warned the HOA board about." I gestured vaguely towards the sodden mess that was Brenda's street. The dam, as I also repeatedly informed them, provided significant flood mitigation for these very properties. Its removal, as predicted, has had certain hydrological consequences. Henderson took the envelope, his eyes scanning the top letter, the one with the 500 fine emblazoned on it. He sighed, a deep, heartfelt sound. "Mrs. Krause seems to believe you intentionally directed the water, Mr. Peterson." "Chief," I replied, meeting his gaze squarely. "Water flows downhill. It also flows where it's no longer impeded. I removed an impediment as lawfully ordered. The laws of physics did the rest. My warnings regarding this exact scenario are a matter of record." He nodded slowly. My lawyer, Arthur Jenkins, who I'd alerted, arrived shortly thereafter. No longer cautious, Arthur was now radiating a quiet, righteous fury of his own, having seen the sheer vindictiveness of the HOA's actions. He smoothly interposed himself, handling Henderson's further, more procedural questions, while I maintained a posture of somber, cooperative concern. Dave Haglund, my eccentric ally, was in his element. He wasn't gloating publicly, but I saw him later, talking quietly with a couple of the news reporters, pointing towards the high-water marks on Brenda's house, then gesturing towards my property, then shrugging with an air that said, "Well, what did you expect?" He was, I suspected, subtly feeding them information about the original development's questionable floodplain construction, details he'd unearthed from his Army Corps archives. The local corruption angle began to twitch. Whispers started. Had the Harmony Creek developers cut corners? Had county officials looked the other way when the initial permits were issued decades ago, long before the current storm drainage standards? Brenda's accusations, shrill and unsupported by anything other than her own fury, began to sound less like a victim's outcry and more like the desperate deflections of a leader who had catastrophically failed. The evidence, my meticulously compiled documentation, was a silent, unshakable counter-narrative. The visual of her, drenched and raving, juxtaposed with my calm, dry, and well-documented position, was playing out beautifully on the local news. They had demanded a clear channel for the water. I had provided it. They simply hadn't anticipated where that channel would lead. The public reckoning was swift and merciless, much like the floodwaters themselves. My meticulously kept records, the ignored warnings, the dismissed meteorological data, the outrageous fine, Brenda's triumphant pre-demolition pronouncements, became the backbone of every news report. The narrative shifted dramatically. I was no longer the rogue homeowner with the dangerous dam. I was the Cassandra, the expert whose warnings were tragically, and for some, expensively, ignored. The 500 fine, once Brenda's cudgel, now looked like an act of egregious bullying, a vindictive overreach of HOA power that had backfired spectacularly. "Oh, President's hubris blamed for Harmony Creek flood disaster," screamed one local headline. Another, more nationally syndicated piece ran with, "Suburban standoff. Engineer forced to demolish dam. Predictable flooding ensues." My face, calm and faintly sorrowful in the news clips, was juxtaposed with images of Brenda Krause, wild-eyed and mud-splattered, making increasingly incoherent accusations. The contrast was devastatingly effective. The supporting neighbors, the silent majority who had endured Brenda's reign with quiet trepidation, found their voices. One by one, they came forward, speaking to reporters, posting on community forums, confirming my warnings, detailing Brenda's dismissive arrogance at HOA meetings. Mr. Peterson told us, he literally showed us charts. One elderly resident, Mrs. Gable, told a news crew, her voice trembling slightly. Brenda just laughed and said he was trying to scare us into letting him keep his ugly dirt pile. This was the rebellion fodder I had hoped for, the community turning against its own failed leadership. The HOA board meetings, or what was left of them, as several board members had also suffered significant flooding and were suddenly less inclined to defend Brenda's actions, became scenes of open revolt. Residents, armed with copies of my warnings and news clippings, demanded accountability, resignations, and most urgently, solutions to the now glaringly obvious drainage problems in Harmony Creek. Lawsuits began to fly, not just against the HOA for negligence, but against the original developers of Harmony Creek, as Dave Hagelin's carefully leaked information about floodplain violations gained traction. County officials, smelling a scandal and potential liability, launched their own investigations into the HOA's governance and the decades-old development permits. The climactic confrontation, if it could be called that, occurred at an emergency town hall meeting hastily convened by the county. Brenda, surprisingly, attended. Perhaps she thought she could still salvage her reputation, still spin the narrative. She looked diminished, her usual brassy confidence replaced by a haggard, defensive air. When she tried to speak, to once again blame me for maliciously diverting water, a low murmur of dissent rippled through the crowded hall. Then, Chief Henderson, in his official capacity, presented a summary of his findings. "Mr. Peterson," he stated, his voice carrying clearly, "acted in full compliance with a legally binding order from the Harmony Creek HOA. His warnings regarding potential flood risks associated with the dam's removal during this predicted severe weather event were numerous, well-documented, and ultimately tragically accurate. There is no evidence of malicious intent on his part. The damage, extensive as it is, appears to be the direct consequence of removing a long-standing flood mitigation structure immediately prior to a historically significant rainfall, a decision driven by the HOA itself. The silence that followed was profound. Then, someone in the back started to applaud, slowly at first, then joined by others, until the hall was filled with a wave of sound that wasn't for Brenda. It was a public repudiation, a collective acknowledgement of her folly. She visibly shrank, her face crumbling. Her delusional control had shattered against the hard rock of facts and the fury of a community betrayed. My inner monologue was quiet, almost somber. Justice, like water, finds its own level. Sometimes you just have to remove the dam of arrogance that holds it back. There was no exultation, only the grim acknowledgement of an equation balanced, a lesson harshly taught but thoroughly learned. The public reckoning was complete. Brenda Krause was no longer a neighborhood tyrant. She was a cautionary tale, a synonym for hubris and its devastating consequences. The news cameras zoomed in on her face, a portrait of public humiliation. And I, the reluctant warrior, merely watched, my expression unreadable. The new equilibrium settled over Harmony Creek like a layer of fine, alluvial silt, a permanent alteration of the landscape, both physical and social. The floodwaters eventually receded, leaving behind a trail of ruined basements, buckled asphalt, and shattered illusions. Brenda Krause became a pariah, her name invoked only in hushed tones or as the punchline to a dark joke. She sold her water-damaged house at a considerable loss, and moved, according to local gossip, to a desert community in Arizona, presumably one with very strict rules about cacti placement and a distinct lack of troublesome creeks. The Harmony Creek HOA, crippled by lawsuits, internal dissent, and a complete loss of credibility, effectively disbanded. Its authority, once wielded with such petty tyranny, evaporated like morning mist. My reputation, ironically, was not just restored but burnished. I became the reluctant sage, the man who had seen the inevitable, spoken truth to power, and been vindicated by the raw, indifferent judgment of nature. Neighbors who had once eyed me with suspicion now greeted me with a kind of awed respect. Some even sought my advice on drainage issues for their own properties, a request I always met with polite, professional detachment. I rebuilt a section of the dam, a smaller, more modest structure, strictly for the protection of my own land, fully permitted and engineered to be unassailable by any future incarnation of neighborhood governance. It was a subtle, defiant statement. I would manage my water, on my terms, respecting its power. The symbolic fence, the boundary of their arrogance, was gone, replaced by the clear, hard lines of consequence. The porchlight of their ignorance had been decisively snuffed out. The locked gate of psychological closure finally clicked shut for me. The fight was over. My family was safe. The emotional anchor that had driven my every calculated move. Sarah and I would often walk by the new, smaller dam in the evenings, the creek gurgling peacefully. The memory of the flood, of Brenda's reign, was a scar on the community, but for us, it was also a testament to resilience, to the ferocious, protective loyalty that binds a family. Emily and Tom, though young, had learned a valuable, if harsh, lesson about the world, that expertise matters, that arrogance has a price, and that sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one with the most effective arsenal. I reflected often on the cost. There was no true joy in their ruin, only the grim satisfaction of a necessary outcome, a problem identified, a threat neutralized. It was the cold, clean logic of engineering applied to a human equation. The moral cost, the metaphorical blood of unleashing such a force, was a weight I would always carry. A reminder that even justified actions have repercussions. The reluctant warrior was no longer dormant within me. He was awake, watchful, a permanent part of who I had become. He understood that sometimes peace is only achieved after a decisive battle. The language of my life had subtly shifted, incorporating the precise, weaponized narration I had employed in my internal war. My emotional restraint remained, but there was a new current of somber resilience, a quiet authority that needed no bluster. So, yes, they demanded I demolish my dam. A structure my grandfather built with foresight and respect for the land. They issued their ultimatums, their outrageous fines, blinded by their petty lust for control. And I complied. I complied with a surgical precision they failed to anticipate, adhering to their demands with a literalness that became their undoing. They got exactly what they asked for. A clear, unimpeded channel for the water. They just never bothered to ask where that channel would lead. They assumed it would simply disappear, like their common sense. Instead, it led directly to their doorsteps, a deluge of their own making, delivered with the full, impartial force of nature, facilitated by a man who simply understood which way the water would flow. You won't believe what happened, you might say. But then again, given the ingredients of arrogance, ignorance, and a convenient, well-documented rain season, it was, in hindsight, utterly, devastatingly predictable.